Hey guys, so of course we're still waiting for that ban list to come out, and it looks like a lot of players are pretty disgruntled about the current format. So it kind of gave me an idea where usually in my ban list prediction surveys I ask people how satisfied they are with the current format. So I thought I'd actually do a compilation on put a historic trend of how people feel about this format, or rather the current format, over the course of the last couple of years. And before we continue, definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as supplies. I also got a new sponsor in Hobbiesville. You can use Hakuna5 for 5% off for all products there. So anyways, as I mentioned earlier, this is essentially going to be a summary of the last couple of years in terms of the questions I've asked on my surveys on how satisfied you are with the current format. In terms of the player profile of those that respond to my surveys, if you're not familiar, usually it's, a few hundred respondents each time, and the player profile looks something like this. I sort of essentially combine all of the last couple of years worth, and it's about 80-82% being at least at the semi-competitive level, which means they at least go to local level events regularly, just so in terms of helping you interpret some of the results you're going to see in this video. So anyways, let's just look at how satisfied people have been with the current Yu-Gi-Oh format over the last couple of years, and I essentially just combined those that responded as satisfied or strongly satisfied and just summarize that as a percentage. So essentially the farthest I can go back is April 2022 timeframe when I did the balance prediction survey there, and we had about 18% being satisfied or strongly satisfied. That's pretty low, right? And if you recall, this was actually around YCS Charlotte format. This is actually the first time premier events came back to play after COVID, and Prank Kids Adventure, that was like the best deck at the time. And honestly, any kind of like adventure pile like Eldritch, you had like the 60 card adventure synchro pile or whatever you call it. Flunder was still around that too, and so it was maybe not the most fun time, but at the same time this was the very first time I did ask this question. Keep that in mind. And then we actually went up a lot around July 2022. So I should also clarify the time frames where this is all the data points are being mapped out on is just around the time that I did the balance prediction surveys, which was essentially sort of a guess on when the balance might come out next. Anyways, July 2022, at this point we had Sword Soul, Branded Despia being the top decks, kind of a nostalgic thing to see, right? And it's kind of funny that it was that high, or at least quote unquote high, much higher than before, when Sword Soul was like Protoss locking at this point, I believe. You also had like Punk Therian, I think, that was also kind of like a new meta contender, which is kind of cool to see. If I recall, I think they were pretty susceptible to draw, and they didn't actually last very long in terms of meta. Same can be said for something like ABC Adventure, for example. It was briefly at one point even a tier 1 deck arguably, and that really just like fell off very fast. And then we kind of plummet again in November 2022 to around 20% satisfaction, and try to guess why that is. And if you haven't already guessed it, it was when tier limits officially became sort of like tier 0, right? November 2022, that's when like the Shizu cards came out, and as you can see, tier limits became like really strong, and you still had Sprite as like a second, but a very distant second. I should also clarify these Dueling Book tier scores that I show on here. It's based on like my meta tier list over the past couple of years. The scores themselves don't actually compare them across different time frames. The formula has changed a lot during that time frame, and so the score should only be compared within the same month, for example. So you saw something like Thunder because of Shifter, Dragon Link, I guess because Bestials, they were also rather incorporated and came out at the time, and Dragon Link of course made use of them very well, but really they were all very distant compared to something like Tearlands. And then it actually went up a little bit. I mean, even though, for example, let's say in December 2022, we actually did have that sort of quote-unquote emergency ban list. You had like very minor hits tier limit, something like Herald of Orange hit, for example, and bringing back something like D-Fissure. They didn't really do anything, obviously. And at this point, early in the next year, we were still waiting for a proper ban list to hit tier limits. Surprisingly, the satisfaction level didn't actually go down much at all at that point. And again, as you see here, nothing much really changed for the top decks. Tier limit was still by far number 1. Sprite a distant second. Flunder was still there, but you still had actually Runic kind of come back as well. And then it actually went up a lot, the satisfaction. And this is funny because this is after now Tealman got that massive hit on the ban list. Like all the names were limited. For example, Kit Kalos got banned. And also you had something like Cashier now come into the mix, which is funny that the satisfaction level would go this high when Cashier face down banishing was legal with Mind Hacker. I think it more so reflects the fact that tier elements just kind of disappeared, and that's really where the satisfaction kind of came from, because Kashira, especially, you would have seen all those memes from YCS Vegas against John Wilkin. Zone locking was not also a great mechanic either, but you saw Sprite being pretty consistent as well. You had even like Nicheria and Mathmech at this point. It had completely disappeared after Bestials came into the mix in the game. But then you had, I remember this just coming out of nowhere, really. It was just able to play a lot of hand traps, for example, against Cashier. That could still hinder them, even though, of course, if they had something like Shifter, then it was very hard for Mathmech. But Mathmech did have a very brief time where it actually found success again after like Power of the Elements format, even though it also, of course, after Circular got banned, completely died off. And then surprisingly, July 2023, now if you recall, this is like the last year's NAWCQ, EU WCQ format. The satisfaction level actually stayed about the same, but I do specifically recall anecdotally during that time, a lot of people were upset with something like Eradicator Virus, because I believe it was like top 4 of the live stream for one of the WCQs, or maybe both, where Eradicator just like ripped out like 5 cards essentially. So it wasn't great, and again, the format pretty much looked the same as it was before, but at least the satisfaction level was honestly pretty solid, at least compared to what it was in the past. And then now you go really high, or at least, again, relatively speaking, it's really high, because with Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of people like to complain, of course. So we're not going to have like really, really high satisfaction levels with this game, at least I don't think. But 60% is honestly the highest we've had, at least in the times in the last 2 years that I've been sort of keeping track of this. And this was during like the Age of Overload format. So this is where SP, for example, just came into the mix. You had Rescue Ace now being really a clear #1 deck, but you also had something like Unchained, right? And you had all those like YCS in like September timeframe, like Vancouver, Cancun. I do remember a lot of people really enjoying that format too, but of course I guess you could argue some were not as big a fan of like a very diverse format, because it can be harder to decide. But you had something like Tearlands, for example, come back into the mix. Pearly as well. For example, Infernoble, that's something we haven't seen in a while now, ever since Zolde got banned, so this was pretty short-lived. So you know what, it was still looks like a lot of people were enjoying this time frame, and I'm sure many of you might agree. And then of course now February 2024, it really starts plummeting. And of course at this point, in January you had the Maze set come out with like Bonfire, that sort of really kicked things off after Age of Overload with like Wanted Engine coming out, and for example, and then now with Phantom Nightmare also coming out in February 2024 with like the Snake Eye support that made them really relevant. Things really started kicking off with the Snake Eye format. If you recall though, Fire King Snake Eye was actually more popular and the most popular option when that set first dropped, with Pure Snake Eye being a close second, and Voiceless Voice of course now emerging as a meta contender, but everything else was pretty distant. And you also start seeing Rescue Ace just completely start falling off more and more, starting from this time frame, even though the deck in itself didn't actually get any worse. It was just that there were better decks available now, right? And then now you move into June 2024. I did this balance prediction survey at the time because a lot of people thought, hey, maybe there actually is a chance that a balance might come into effect before the NAWCQ, for example. You had Infinite Info coming in the corner as well. Of course, that didn't end up happening, but at this time frame, now, Pure Snake Eye, of course, by far the most popular deck. Tenpai Dragon had also come into the mix post Legacy of Destruction, and Voiceless Voice and even Melodious were actually kind of kicking it pretty well after that Legacy Destruction set. Of course, both of these have actually fallen quite hard since post Info. So after all that, I also did a recent survey a couple of weeks ago, now that we know that a balance should come out end of August-ish, as mentioned by Konami, and somehow the satisfaction level went from 11 to even lower to 9%. People are nonetheless, safe to say, that very, very dissatisfied with this current format. And of course, I don't really have to show you the meta tier list for this month. We are all pretty familiar with it. This was done at the beginning of the month, so things might change a little bit, but I think we can agree the first 3 are pretty accurate in terms of Snake Eye, Tenpai, as well as Yubel. And so if we look at this graph again, in terms of satisfaction level, I usually also ask on those balance prediction surveys, if you like this current format compared to the previous format. And anecdotally, it always feels like Yu-Gi-Oh players tend to complain more about the current format compared to the previous format, and they always seem to like whatever previous format more, right? But if you look at that question in terms of agree plus strongly agree, it actually maps and aligns pretty well with the satisfaction that you just saw on a slide earlier. So it wasn't necessarily that they always complain about the current format versus and liking it less than the previous format. There are times definitely people do still actually like the current format more than the previous format. So you know what, it does actually still happen. anyways, that was a summary of the last couple of years in terms of satisfaction level with the Yu-Gi-Oh format, of course, based on the type of players that respond to my survey at least. So hopefully you did find that interesting. I think it doesn't take a genius to know that, you know, a lot of people are not very satisfied with the format right now. I can also tell based on some of the videos that I create and I post, there's really just not that much interest in this current format at all. I think the good thing with Yu-Gi-Oh is that, you know, the format for the most part, compared to, let's say, like a lot of different games out there, at least it tends to change pretty rapidly. There's always like different sets coming out, and that also, of course, can be a bit of a con as well. Sometimes it moves a little too fast, but nonetheless, hopefully Konami can make a really big splash, and hopefully we can all be a lot more excited again with whatever Yu-Gi-Oh format that we're gonna have upcoming. But anyways, really curious to hear your thoughts in terms of what you think of the format, what you hope will change. You can definitely go check out my most recent balance prediction survey video, because I also have some additional sort of questions on, you know, how likely were you to like quit this game, for example, or what other trading card games did you pick up during this format. So you can definitely go check those out as well. Anyways, big thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors as always for the continued support, and well, take care guys.